Happy Friday, everybody. This is a particularly good past couple of days. Does anybody know what yesterday was? Yesterday was National Cheeseburger Day. Yes, and given my proclivity for cheeseburgers, you can tell my excitement. This is one of the rare times when National Cheeseburger Day fell on a day that I could actually go to Seabreeze and have my preferred cheeseburger of choice. So I got my black and blue cheeseburger, which is a Cajun grilled burger topped with blue cheese. It was amazing. And if you're hungry right now, well, I can only tell you that it was delicious, and you can suffer for it. But I'm almost more excited for today. Does anybody know what today is? Today is International Talk Like a Pirate Day. International Talk Like a Pirate Day. So, in that vein, what did I do? I decided that I wanted to make sure that everybody got AIS to pirate translations today. So let's go ahead. Talk Like a Pirate Day. Okay. So a little bit of background on this. When I was working at KPMG, I did some accounting to pirate translations because I was working in public accounting at the time and I thought it was good. I also did forensic accounting translations. So a little bit of context how this works. Okay, so sometimes on a normal day you have to explain that your boss is kind of is grouchy, is a little bit unhappy. So my boss was a young lady named Charlotte, and she was generally very pleasant, but sometimes she'd get in a mood. Usually it's because of something I did. But so on a normal day, I'd say, be careful. Charlotte is not in a good mood. All right. But if it's talk like a pirate day, then we'd be like, the sea, she be angry today. All right. So how do some of the things that we've talked about in AIS, how do they translate to pirate? All right. So here we go. Here are my AIS to pirate translations. I did use a little bit of help with Copilot on this to translations, but most of these are my own interpretation. So IT governance is a critical component of the organizational infrastructure. All right. A pirate would say, we need a sturdy keel lest we be lost to chaos and mutiny. All right. IT access controls are primarily preventative in nature. Okay. Sturdy locks on your treasure chest be stopping scallywags from plundering. Yeah. All right. There we go. All right. Cybersecurity is a growing concern on the modern business landscape. The Kraken rises from the depths, threatening the calm seas of trade. All right. Number four, despite their potential, cryptocurrencies still have challenges as a means of exchange. And we have this booty do be of dubious value. And then finally, of course, I feel that Dr. Barnes was a bit unfair in his grading. All right. We have the captain be a bilge rat. All right. So hopefully that helps you with your discussions today. Okay. I'm sure all of your instructors will expect you to talk like pirates, and this should get you part of the way. All right. So I'm not going to actually talk like a pirate for the rest of the rest of the day because my Excel to pirate translations are a little bit rusty. But hopefully you get a little bit of value out of that. All right. So what are we doing today? We are doing macros. So how many people have experience with Excel macros? Minimal experience, so much so. So I'm going to go ahead and preface this by saying that my experience with macros is probably greater than yours, but I do not consider myself an expert by any means. What we're going to be doing are very rudimentary macros. That being said, I do think they have some value. So first of all, for the assignment, make sure you go to Brightspace and download the two files because you'll want to have those for context. Um, Also, I would have the instructions as a reference because having them as a reference will be very helpful for you as you're preparing these macros. So when we talk about Excel, I've already alluded to the fact that basically anything that we do in Excel, any task that we perform in Excel, there is an accompanying piece of code written in a background program. Does anybody remember the background program name that I mentioned? Visual Basic, all right? So imagine that you're a coder and you're wanting to run these tasks. You could type this out. You could type the code out and have Excel run those tasks individually, or we could just do the shortcut and just kind of point and click or enter the formulas. So Excel, for all its complexities, is actually a lot more complex if we were to look at the background code. All right, so that's going to be an example of how we would think about the macro, or how we think about what Excel is doing. Now, this leads to some interesting opportunities because if it's recording code, if it's actually creating code as we're doing things, then we should be able to utilize that code in multiple ways. We shouldn't just have to use it and say this code is basically a one-time use only and we can't ever replicate it. If we could have a recording function, then we could use that code over and over again. And that's effectively what a macro is. A macro takes the Visual Basic code and replicates it. Now, that has there's some suspicion as to how valuable something like this is, simply because if we're doing a series of static tasks, there's not really a reason to redo that. It's like, okay, I typed the numbers 1, 2, 3 in. How often am I going to type the numbers 1, 2, 3 in again? And that's a fair assessment. But for some of the code, if we particularly use a dynamic path, we can replicate this code in ways that allow us to change our inputs and still perform that, still get the same series of steps. So let's just go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and walk you through a very, very simple example, and then we're going to talk about how we're going to use this for our own purposes. All right. So let's go ahead and open Excel. And one of the things that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to enable the ability to use macros. Now, I do want to make a note here that if you ever get a note when we're working through this, there's maybe a yellow ribbon that says enable content is one of the buttons. You will need to enable content here, otherwise the macros will not work. All right, so make sure that if that pops up that you do enable the content. Very first thing is we need our developer tool, which you'll notice it's not up here. It should be between automate and help, but that's not too hard to fix. We can go ahead and go to file. And then we're going to go down to options. And we want to customize the ribbon. And if you'll notice, the developer button is right down here. So as long as we just enable that, click OK, it will come up. Now, if you've already got developer enabled, then you don't need to do anything. If you don't have developer enabled, very hard to do macros without that. So make sure you've got developer enabled.
Where is I see something called macros, but I don't.
So it's going to be under the developer tab, and it's going to be called macros. Now, if you're using a Mac and looking for the button on a Mac, I'm going to be completely and totally useless in helping you there. I know that macros are going to be helpful in a Mac or be available on a Mac, but I can't tell you where they are. I'm assuming they're probably under developer tab, but I could be wrong. Should be and could be are two different things. Okay. So let's walk through a very, very basic scheme. Here's what I want you to do. Let's zoom in a little bit, and let's just go ahead and rename this tab test. All right. Somewhere on the tab, I'm going to do cells B2 through B4. I'm going to type in the numbers 1, 2, and 3. That's all I really want you to do is type in those 3 numbers. All right. Now, from this point, we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a macro based on this input. Now, like I said, a macro is just recording all activity that you're going to be doing. So there are a few steps before we start the macro that I want you to walk through with me, and I'll explain why these are important. They're going to seem a little bit redundant. It's going to be like a waste of, you're going to say like, Dr. Barnes, you're wasting time. And I say that's fair, but there's actually legitimate reasons why we're doing this. So first of all, in order to save a macro, we need to be able to have a macro-enabled workbook, which is a different file type than what you normally have for Excel. So let's go ahead and go up to File, Save As. We don't need to worry about the shared libraries. And I'm just going to put this on my desktop. And I'm just going to call this MTF1 because I'm going to say macro test file 1. Now, before you save this, it says Save as Type. Click on the down arrow, and you will notice that below Excel Workbook, there's a file type called Excel Macro Enabled Workbook. This is not a default file type, and it will never save unless you tell it to save it like this. So we want to actually save there. Now, part of the reason that macros are kind of frowned upon is that they contain additional code, and that could be malicious code. So a lot of organizations tend to be very, very tentative about allowing macros to work. In fact, when you open certain macro-enabled workbooks, if you have transferred them between computers, it will say, there's a macro on here. Are you sure you want to open this? Do you trust this? Because it may spew out a virus. And so we have to be very careful that we're not opening viruses when we're opening macro workbooks. But I'm just going to call this here, and I'm going to save this to my desktop. Now, this is going to seem really, really counterintuitive, but I'll explain why we're going to do this when we open it back up. What I'd like for you to do is I'd like you to close the workbook. All right. Now we're going to open the workbook back up. which say, okay, Dr. Barnes, now you're just wasting your time. That's my goal here, is because I need to earn your tuition dollars. So I'm just going to waste time. No, I actually do have a good reason why we're doing this. All right. So part of the reason that we did that is the best practice to always start with sheet one when you start writing a macro. If I were to start writing my macro without closing the workbook, it's going to start from sheet two. All right. Because I'm going to create a new sheet and it's going to say, you already have one sheet in here. Let's add the second sheet. By opening the workbook from scratch, then I can actually start from sheet two. So let's go ahead. And again, it's going to seem like there's some redundancy, but trust me when I say it's always just a good idea to close and open back up again. Go to developer. And the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to click on record macro. Now, if you want to describe your macro, that's fine. I'm just going to leave it as macro one because we don't need to. One thing I will encourage you to do, and you'll see this once we actually run through the macros that I created, is that you may want to start it with a prefix like the letter A to actually do a sequence. I would prefer to start with numbers, but because this is an old code, Visual Basic is very old, you can't actually start file names with a number. All right, so that's one big drawback. So usually I will say A underscore and then whatever your file name or macro name is going to be, or just start it with letter A and then type in the macro name. Or we could actually say macro one, and that would be a sequence because the next one would be macro two. That doesn't really describe what the macro is doing, which we may want a little bit more detail on that. But I would encourage it to be sequential. We'll see why that's an issue in here shortly. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to record a macro. Now, once we click on OK, it is recording, and everything we do in Excel is being tracked in Visual Basic, and we'll be able to replicate that. We're going to do a very simple process. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to click on create a new sheet, which you will notice it creates sheet number one. I'm going to make this a little bit larger so everybody can see. You can make it larger if you want to, but I'm just mostly doing that so people can see what's going on. And I'm going to link to the sheet these numbers. So I want to actually have these pull off previous sheet. So from the test sheet, I want to pull off 1, 2, and 3. So you can see it says equals test B2. Then I can drag that down and copy those. It's also just do a little formatting item to show that the formatting can work. So let's go ahead and add a bottom border here. And then we're going to run a formula. We're going to do a very simple sum formula. So I want you to just do those steps. I want you to link all those numbers from the previous tab. I want you to create a border on the bottom to kind of show that we're going to do a mathematical operation, and then we're going to add them all together using a sum function. Once you've done that, well, let's go ahead and also rename the sheet just because sheet one's let's go ahead and say result. That sounds so good. Once we've done those 4 steps, go back up to developer and click on stop recording. Now, one thing that's fairly new, I've just noticed this, is that it will actually hold your Visual Basic script, which is your VBA script. It also creates an Office script, which I'm not familiar with, something that I want to investigate. The only reason I haven't got any more information about what that is I just learned about that literally this morning, like when I was testing the macros in my office. So that's why we're not going to deal with that today, because I don't know anything about it, but that seems to be an important tool that could be useful moving forward. Okay. So we've got a macro recorded. Let's go ahead and save our workbook. Now, the value of something like this is that we can replicate what we've just done if we have something set up properly. Now, there's a lot of dynamic ability in a macro. You could actually run this with a different setups. Like if you wanted to sum a series of numbers and you didn't want to specify what the series range is, you could actually create that in a macro. That's a lot more difficult than what we're going to be doing for our particular tasks. But if you wanted to do that, the macros could actually be adaptive to different situations. The adaptive macros are definitely the most powerful. One of the macros that I remember most fondly was actually back when I was at KPMG. We used Excel for visualization because keep in mind this was the dark ages in the 2000s. When we were still working without Power BI or Tableau. And so Excel was basically our visualization tool. It's all we had. we would actually take data dumps from IDEA, and we would put them into Excel, and then we'd run a macro to format all the data in a particular tabs. It was beautiful too, because it could adapt to whatever data size set we had. Whoever did that must have put out hundreds of hours in developing the macro. It was well beyond my capabilities. I was always in awe whenever I ran it. Anyway, let's go ahead and let's test this out. Let's test this out. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to leave this file open. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to open a new Excel file. And we're going to format this Excel file very similarly to the one that we had before. Now, we're going to save this file, but we're just going to save it as a normal Excel file. So again, I'm going to type in 4, 5, 6 different numbers, but we're going to keep the same format. I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call this test. And then I'm going to save this, and I'm just going to call this macro test file 2 or MTF2. Now, quick note, we've already saved our macro. We do not need to do this as a macro-enabled workbook. This is one we're going to run the macro on. You can run a macro on a non-macro-enabled workbook. You just have to have the macro enabled, or the file where the macro is stored open at the time. We'll see how that works here in just a second. So just go ahead and save this as a normal Excel workbook. And as before, we're going to close this. What was the reason again? Start on sheet 1. Yeah, that's why we want to start and do that. So let's go ahead. Well, where on earth did my MTF go? Okay, well. All right. So here's the deal, is that I've got a macro set to run on a format that looks very similar to this. It was conducted on different inputs, but that should not matter. The code should be adaptive to different inputs. So here's what I want to do is I'm going to run the developer. I'm going to go over to macros. You notice it references the other file. It says this macro is stored in MTF1, which you currently have open. That is a requirement for any macro, by the way. You have to have the Excel file where the macro is stored open in order to run that. If it's the case, if it's similar, if it's formatted in the exact same structure, at least to the adaptive, enough to be adaptive, then we can run it and we can actually accomplish the same task. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to run this macro. And would you look at that? Different inputs, but the macro worked on the new inputs. Now, I can tell that you're not really that impressed. That was not very much of a task, okay? That was very much a task. The good news is that you're going to have one that's going to be very impressive, and that's going to be what the work is that you got assigned for today, all right? So let's go ahead and talk about what the assignment is for today. So back in managerial accounting, when we were doing managerial accounting, the old textbook for managerial accounting, I don't think they've been using it now for a couple of years, but I think it was probably still the one in there. It was the Horngren's managerial accounting. That was the one that everybody used. Something that was very unique about this, and I think it was just lazy, but I also think that it serves our purposes really well, is that if you looked at the problems, they had a series of problems called Problems Series A and Problem Series B. Does everybody remember that, by the way? So problem series A was a series of problems, and then B was just exactly the same problems in the exact same sequence with different numbers. And the idea is that you get to practice more than once, okay? You practice one time and you practice on the exact same problem. Again, I felt that was a little bit lazy, but it serves really well for what we're going to be doing, because if you did the problem or one problem in a certain way, you should be able to replicate your results in another one. And when I say exact, I mean precise. Exactly. So the second chapter that we did in managerial accounting, I used to teach managerial accounting, and so we did in managerial accounting was a monster problem, and it was one that I actually had my students do in Excel. So it involved creating T accounts, creating a trial balance, creating a cost of goods sold statement, and then its income statement. Now, in earlier iterations of this macro assignment, it was actually took place over a 2-week period. And part of this was the first week was replicating this, remembering everything that you did back in 221 and having to do it all over again. And then the second part was, once you learned how to do that, creating the macros. I have chopped the Gordian knot, and I said that's a lot of wasted time. That in that week that we could that we were doing the replication was kind of not really worthwhile, because I'm assuming everybody knows managerial accounting. You're taking a seminar on it right now. So I actually created a series of workbooks that you can just go ahead and draw your information from. You'll notice that the workbooks are called Excel 3, Accounting 221, problem set 1732A, and Excel 3, problem 1738B. So these are the exact problems from the assignment that was back in 221. Now, the idea behind this is, if you look at the tabs, past the first three tabs, everything that is incorporated in this particular workbook is a function of the first three tabs. Technically speaking, the last two tabs, because this first one is just the original problem itself. I copied and pasted it, which I realize there's probably copyright violations in doing that. Please don't tell anybody. All right. I kind of like this problem. But anyway, so if that's the case, we're going to be using that to create T accounts, and then subsequently trial balance, cost of goods manufactured, and then doesn't show it, but the income statement. Now, how does this work? Well, some of this information I just typed in by hand. I know that I wanted a raw materials inventory account, and I will know what I will want that in every scenario. I will know that I want beginning balance and ending balance. And then I'll want some transactions, but the transaction amounts could change. They could fluctuate. So if you look at the transaction amounts, those actually come either from the original trial balance. Are you in the way? Get out of the way. Okay, there we go. The original trial balance right here, or if they're transactions, they come from the journal entries. So all of the inputs are dynamic. Now, how do we know they're dynamic? Let's imagine that I change one of these inputs. It's going to throw the trial balance off. But let's imagine I change my raw materials from 6,000 to 5,000. Now, if I go to my T accounts, my T account has changed to 5,000. The ending balance has changed, and it's thrown off my trial balance, my cost of goods manufactured, and my income statement all by $1,000. So everything is derived from a single source, or actually, technically speaking, two sources, but it all kind of flows together into a single source. So this is really, really nice, because if we, and let me go ahead and before I move on too far, I'm going to change this back to the original number so we don't have it. This is really nice because if we have something that follows this format, we should be able to create a macro that can follow this, that can actually replicate this, assuming that our format is the same. Now, does everybody see why these problems are unique for this task? Because if I create a macro based on this initial data, I'm going to create a macro based on this data from this Mighty Stars trial balance and transactions. If I have something that's formatted exactly the same way, I can create the exact same series of statements, the T accounts, the trial balance, all that, from the new data, assuming that it's in the same format. So how do we go about that? Well, I'm going to show you the end result, and then I'm going to leave it to your imagination. So here's my macro storage file. I guess I have to specify that I'm going to open that with Excel. Weird. Okay, so here's that enable content that I mentioned right here. Will not work without the enable content. Yes, a trusted document. I trust myself. There's a couple of different ways to do that. So you'll notice that I've got a macro storage file. There's also, just for context, this file right here. It says macro storage blank, and you will notice that there is nothing here because we don't need data in the file for the macro to store. The macro has still been stored back here, or the macros have been stored. But I don't need the data in here because all I care about is the macro being in that file. So that's kind of an interesting little nuance. So let's just go ahead and run this on a test. So this is what your file should look like after you do all of the editing that's in the instructions. You should have a trial balance and a series of transactions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what my macros look like once everything's been done. Now, here's one of the things that I will note. You will notice that when I named my macros, that I just called them the macros for the tabs that I wanted to put them on. I didn't put a prefix of A, like I told you, A, B, C, D. So they're going to be run out of order because I want to run the T accounts first and then the adjusted trial balance and the cost of goods manufactured and the income statement. So you don't have to put prefixes on there, but keep in mind that if you do that and you try to name the files, they may be run in a different sequence than the order, because Excel will naturally alphabetize them. All right. I do encourage you to name your files so that you know what the macro does. Just doing macro 1, macro 2, macro 3 is not really sufficient, but you could do something like macro 1 underscore T account. That might be a ways to do it as well. So let's go ahead and see if we can do the T account. It's worked every single time I've run it before, so we're going to see if it's finicky this time. Would you look at that? Isn't that beautiful? All right, so continue running the T accounts, or running so I'm going to do cost of goods, or sorry, adjust trial balance next. So I need my trial balance in order to create my cost of goods manufactured. And then once I have the cost of goods manufactured, I can create the income statement. Pretty impressive, huh? All right, that's cool. But keep in mind that I created this macro on this data. So I expect this data to be replicated precisely. What happens when I run the macro that was created on this data on the other data set? Will that work? Well, let's check it out. I'm going to close this this file, and I'm going to open up the other file, this macro test file too. Now, this is the other data set. This is the second problem. It's formatted exactly the same, and this is really important. When you set up your files, they have to be formatted identically. If you make any change, it will create problems. Trust me when I say you don't want problems. So here we go. We're going to run the macros again. T account. Again, these are exact same macros I just ran, but on a different data set. There we got it. If you notice, that end result matches the end result that should be in the test file. That is your task. That is what you all are going to be doing for the assignment, is that you're going to be replicating this particular assignment. So let's go ahead and talk through the instructions, because the instructions will give you some criteria. Now, this is really important. Make a note of this. Read through the instructions one time before you do anything. If you see something that looks odd, like a really weird instruction, make a note of that. There is a reason I put that instruction down. Then as you're working through the assignment, refer back to the instructions. This is really important, because if you miss an instruction, that's a really important point, it will cause you all kinds of heartache. For context, I've done this assignment now for, I think now this is going on the 6th year doing this assignment. The first year I did this, I actually had them try to do everything in a single macro. Is it possible to edit a macro outside of just redoing everything? Yes, you can actually go in and fix the code in Visual Basic. How to do that? Sometimes it's easy if you need to change something like from sheet 3 to sheet 1. If you just need to change one letter or one number, that's fine. If you need to know and fix the code, that's a problem. Okay, fixing the code itself can be a problem. So first and foremost, when you're doing this, I encourage you to write one worksheet at a time, a macro per worksheet. In fact, for the T accounts, if you want to write multiple macros for the T accounts, because you may say, all right, I know I've got this series of T accounts right. I don't want to screw this up. Save this macro. We're in a second macro on the T accounts. That is fine. All right. I would hope that you don't run like 50 macros, because again, keep in mind when I'm grading these, I'm going to rerun your macros. So if you do 50 macros, then I've got to replicate 50 macros. That's a little bit of problematic. But if you want to run somewhere around the series of like 8 or 9 macros, that's probably sufficient. Okay. 4 would be optimal, but I can understand if you want to run more just for posterity. A few notes here. Again, I've given you the note here, the underlined. When you create your macro, save the file, close it, and start and open it back up. Do that every time that you're going to create a new file, because you want to start with sheet 1 on every single one. Is it possible that you could actually have consistent setups where you start with sheet 3? Yes, but it's really, really problematic if it doesn't start with sheet 3, if it just defaults, because then you have to go in and edit your macro to start at a specific sheet number. So I would just say, anytime that you save a file, immediately close it and then open it back up so that you would start your macro recording at that particular sheet. All right, you want to make sure this is sequential. Keep in mind, this is probably the most important thing that I'm gonna mention here. Keep in mind that when you're doing a macro, Excel is going to record every single task that you perform. One of the most tempting things that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to have these source files open. Okay, they're gonna have these source files open on your computer. So these are the files that you're going to be working from. I encourage you to use these files as reference, but what you may want to do is you may want to make a printout of these files or you may want to have these open on a separate device like a tablet or a laptop if you have that available. The reason why is that if you put this on your computer and then say I'm writing my macro and I said, okay, what did Dr. Barnes do here? Let me go back and see, look at this. Okay, I remember what he did on this particular tab. Then you go back to your other workbook. You are effectively telling your macro that when you get to this step, you have to refer back to this workbook because it's tracking everything you're doing in Excel. And this is an Excel file. So it's going to say, I have to go to this Excel file, which means that every single time you run that macro, this Excel file, this specific Excel file has to be open. Guess what I'm not going to allow you to submit as part of your assignment? The original Excel files that I provided you, okay? You get to submit one item, and that one item has to be self-contained. So that creates a problem. You have to make sure that you do this all self-contained. This is, by the way, by far the source of the biggest frustration that students have had is when they've kept more than one file open on a computer. They've gone switched between files and they realize their macro is trying to look for a file that's not open. You know, the solution is, well, we'll just open the file. But that's one of the reasons I said you only get to submit one file, is that I'm going to force you to write this without multiple files open because I don't want to have to open multiple files when I run your macro. Okay, what else? So one thing I want to make note of, when you're testing your macro, you do need to do two series of tests. First of all, you're going to write your macro on the first data set. Once you've created, or your macros, I should say, on the first data set. In order to make sure your macros are adaptive, you're going to have to make sure that they match the other, they work for the other data set as well. Now, the question always comes up, there's a few issues here. Like, for example, you'll notice that in the data set, let's see, in the data set, the first data set is called Mighty Stars. The second data set is called Hero Stars. Some people have said, well, I titled it Hero Stars for all of my macros, and so the second macro now says Mighty Stars instead of Hero Stars, or Hero Stars and Mighty Stars. I don't remember which one's which. I don't particularly care about that. If there's actually an easy way to fix that, you can actually set your formatting up that it refers back to the original trial balance, or the original unadjusted trial balance. You can just say equals that right there, and that way, when you change it, it's not going to be a big deal. But if it's something small like that, or if it's a small formatting issue, do not panic. Okay, you do not need to go and rewrite and refix the entire macro. If your balances don't work, if you come up with a number that is hard, that you accidentally hard coded when you should have had an adaptive, like say for example, in your trial balance, you type in the number $70,000, and so that doesn't change when you run it on the new macro. You will have to fix that, okay? But for small little a little bit details, the minimal details that don't really matter that much, that's fine. Trust me when I say this is going to be a difficult and time-consuming process, as is with this simple task. I do expect that multiple people will have to run multiple macros that they don't want to, like, even though I say you can run 4 macros, that first macro can be a little bit of a booger, that creating those T accounts, especially when you have to do the formatting to try to make everything the same size, same space. You may have to run this multiple times. I think the record for running the first tab is 5 different macros they had run on. I don't know if that record's been beaten. That's only self-confessed. There may be somebody out there had to do it 10 times and just was embarrassed to tell me. But do not get too frustrated about it, because multiple people have done this task over and over again. Part of their exercise in this routine is getting better at it, is making sure that you have to do the steps over and over again so that you fix what the problems are. I will tell you, as a personal experience in writing these macros, I did not get these macros cleanly the first time when I did it. Granted, I was creating the assignment, so that was part of it, but there were times that I had to go back and fix macros. It's not necessarily a clean process. One of the best feelings in the world is when you run a macro and it works perfectly, okay? So I'd encourage you, if you're stressed out about the macro, don't get too frustrated about it. You will get the reward eventually once you get to the macro. As far as what your deliverable is, keep in mind that your deliverable has to be one item, and that's your macro. How am I going to grade this? I'm going to grade you this macro in a very simple manner. I'm going to open up this file here, this second file, this is problem 38B, which is the one that you didn't write your macro on, and so you wrote it on something else. I'm going to rerun the macro, and I'm going to make sure that it meets. If it doesn't meet that, then I'm going to probably rerun it on the first one and see if there are any errors. But I'm going to try to run it and make sure that I get replication. So you need to test your macro not just on the first data set, but on the second data set too, to make sure it's consistent. There are a few things I also want to point out here. So you will notice here that the original the data set that I provided you has got a lot of spurious pieces of information. Like it's got this tab right here for data that you don't need. Also, for each of the parts that are in the problem, I've got these cutouts, screen captures from the book to actually explain what's going on in those. You don't need those as part of your macro. In fact, if you'll notice that in the parts that I created, the sections that I created, the cutouts, I deleted that banner out there. So anything that you do to clean up, you need to make sure that's consistent between the data sets that you create. So the data sets need to be exactly formatted exactly the same way. All right, so that's an important point. If you think that you are really struggling with this, one thing that I may encourage you to do is to try to replicate the assignment in advance. If you feel a little bit uncertain about how to redo the T accounts for this particular problem, you may want to recreate the T accounts manually without recording the macro first. And then once you've done that, say, okay, I feel comfortable doing it. Now I'll go ahead and record the macro doing the T accounts. All right. I know there's a lot of information there. I do expect a lot of questions, but are there any questions now that people want to come up with? All right. Well, I wish you the best of luck on this assignment, and we got 3 minutes left, so I think we'll call it good here. Have a good weekend.